Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's HLAA Employment Task Force webinar on optimizing virtual meetings, empowering individuals with hearing loss to thrive in the digital workplace with our panelist, Padraig Kitterick, Head of Audiological Science, National Acoustics Laboratories, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, and our moderator, Theo Shomsky, Accessibility Technology Engineer at PNC and member of our HLAA Task Force for Accessible Inclusive Employment. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Robin Gardner with HLAA, and I'll be your host today. I'm just going to share my screen and share a couple tech tips with you real quick to make sure that everyone can follow along. Okay. To turn on your captions, you're going to click on the CC icon on your screen and click Show Subtitles. You can change your font size in those subtitle settings. The chat feature is going to be available just for some technical issues and for our panelists today. Please use the Q&A icon to ask any questions. We'll be using these to facilitate the Q&A session after the main presentation. If you've joined by a regular computer, the presentation should be in side-by-side mode. There should be a shared screen with the presentation on the left, and your speakers will appear on the right in your gallery view. You can adjust the size of your side-by-side view by hovering your pointer between the shared screen and the panelist videos, and click on that gray line and slide it to adjust to your desired size. If you're on your cell phone or another mobile device, your view might be a little different, and you may have to scroll between the views to get the desired one. Okay, this disclaimer, the HLAA believes that information about products and services that could benefit people with hearing loss should be made available to consumers to help them make informed decisions about their hearing healthcare. References to any specific products or services or organizations or claims made in HLAA webinars do not constitute endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by HLAA, nor does exclusions suggest disapproval. We make every effort to provide accurate and reliable information. HLAA does not control or guarantee the accuracy, completeness, or efficacy of information contained by presenters about any products or services. Now I'm going to turn it over to David or Michael.
Robin, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm David Baldridge. I'm a professor at Oregon State University. My research involves the workplace experiences of people with hearing loss in particular, among other topics. And I'm also the chair of HLA's Task Force for Accessible Inclusive Employment. So I want to quickly do a shout out to Melissa Cruz for helping arrange this webinar, even though she can't be here today, and for our captioners for making this webinar accessible and inclusive. Our task force you see pictured here, our overall mission is to work with people with hearing loss and their employees and allies to make workplaces more accessible and inclusive. And a lot of us know how difficult that is. So towards that end, we have material on the website. We write articles for Hearing Life magazine. We do workshops at the convention each year. And we do quarterly webinars live as you're joining us today, and also recorded and available on the website. My email address is at the bottom of the slide, so please feel free to reach out to me or any of the other task force members that you might know. So for today, I'm going to turn things over to Theo, but also want to acknowledge Michael Noble, who is our webinar director and helps oversee all of our webinars. Theo Shomsky is the mastermind for our session today. So a big thank you to Theo for organizing this session. So Theo, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. Am I audible? All right. So hello to all. Theo Shomsky. I'm an enterprise digital workplace accessibility technology engineer and a member of the HLAA Task Force for Accessible Inclusive Employment. I'm a white bearded man in a collared shirt in my home office in State College, Pennsylvania, and I do identify as an individual who lives with hearing loss. I am hard of hearing, and I am utilizing a software-based hearing aid through my headset called Sonic Cloud in lieu of my hearing aids. So I take my hearing aids, they go out and they go in the drawer, and I'm on this enhanced headset. So this is something that we're here to talk about today with Padraig Kitterick, head of audiological science at the National Acoustics Laboratories in Australia. Now, as we all know, for people with hearing loss, trying to communicate using video conferencing technology is super challenging, unless you have the right setup to do so, and that's why we're here today. So Padraig and his team at the National Acoustic Labs set out to evaluate in a formal study what listening setups are the most effective to enhance speech understanding while reducing listening effort and increasing user satisfaction over video conferencing for those who live with hearing loss. So they could ultimately identify solutions for the challenges people like us who live with hearing loss face today in conference calls, especially for those in the virtual workforce. So Padraig, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Theo. Absolute pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to give you a short presentation about some of the research, as Theo mentioned, that we've been doing on this topic, and then really looking forward to having a discussion with Theo and with you all today. So let me just share my slides. There we go. And Theo, can I just check the slides are coming through? Yeah.
It looks like
Okay.
we see your screen here.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So as Theo said, my name is Padraig Kitterick. I'm the head of Audiological Science at NAL. For those of you not familiar with NAL, we're a government-funded research laboratory here in Sydney, Australia. And our mission is to improve the lives of people with hearing problems and hearing loss through research and innovation. And one of the things I'm going to talk to you about today is some examples of the research program that we do to try to improve the outcomes of adults with hearing loss. Now, here at the National Acoustic Labs, we were very busy during COVID, focusing on the impact of things like face masks and coming up with new ways of programming hearing aids to try to minimize the acoustic effects of face masks on other people's speech, to help those with hearing aids hear better during the pandemic. But as we came out of the pandemic, we noted that video conferencing had sort of stayed with us, and to this day has stayed with us all. It's become a really big part of our lives. But we noticed that there wasn't a huge amount of research, much at all actually, on exactly how communicating via platforms such as this, such as Zoom, was impacting on the communication and the efficacy of communication and the effort of communication for people with hearing loss. So we decided to undertake some of this research. And of course, you know, these logos have become very familiar to us all as we have communicated either personally or professionally now, increasingly and continuously through digital platforms like Zoom, Teams, WebEx, and many others that I haven't shown here. And of course, these platforms are supposed to, you know, help us communicate easily whenever and wherever we need to. But actually, for a lot of people, these are images that don't exactly invoke thoughts of joy, because communicating over video conferencing can be very challenging. And so when we looked at the research literature, we were actually surprised to find very little research in trying to understand the kinds of problems and challenges that people with hearing loss might face when communicating via these platforms. And there is an underlying assumption that these platforms have captioning and they have noise reduction features. And so therefore, there's nothing really else to know. The platforms are great. They work very well. It should be easier for people to communicate via these platforms than face-to-face, surely. And that's something that we wanted to test in our research. So I'll start off by looking at the very first thing that we looked at, which is, can we actually get evidence that there are specific challenges that people with hearing loss face when communicating via these platforms? Now, it's quite a simple question, quite challenging to test in a sort of a research methodology, but just to give you a very, very high level view of some of the kinds of approaches we did. We, in one of our studies, compared a participant communicating with an audiologist in an in-person session in a very nice, quiet, comfortable sound testing booth, so about as ideal as you could get. And then we actually transitioned to having the participant and the audiologist in adjacent rooms that were connected via Zoom, so via a video conferencing session, just like we're talking here today. We were able to do this, though, in a way that allowed us to control for many of the things that might make it difficult in a research context to examine what the difference between these two experiences were. We were able to capture a lot of different information about the participant experience. We were able to record things like the participants' body language as well. And we were able to capture and control what kind of acoustic and video information we're sending, so that we can see, can we assess difficulty with communication, the ease of communication, and how well people could communicate over the video link. We did this in a number of ways. We actually, in the first study, compared people who didn't have hearing loss to people who did have hearing loss. And so for the people who didn't have hearing loss, we actually got them to do an in-person session, and then we got them to do it twice over video conferencing, just to make sure that we got nice, stable results. And we switched the order for different people. So some people did in-person first, some people did video conferencing first. It's a very simple design. When it came to people with hearing loss, all of our participants also used some sort of hearing aid or hearing devices. And so what we did was they did an in-person session with their devices on. And then with the video conferencing sessions, they either did it aided and then they did it unaided as well. So we tested both aided and unaided. And we were interested in the impact that the hearing aids or hearing devices were having. And I'll come on a little bit later and talk to you about a range of different ways of listening to video calls that we also examined. As you can see down the bottom, just as a very high level, we did lots of different types of testing. We looked at how well somebody could understand speech in quiet, understanding a conversation in noise, and then captured lots of different self-reported things like listening effort, frustration, satisfaction, sound quality. So this is the first set of results I just want to show you, just to give us a reference point for everything I'm going to show you. So this is showing data for people who did not have hearing loss. I'm showing you a score on the vertical axis here. So higher up the graph means they performed better. And I'm showing you the score in 3 different conditions, face-to-face, and then the first and second video conferencing test. Now there's 2 data points in each condition, and that's just showing you the people who did the video conferencing first or last in the order. And as you can see, that didn't make any difference. The main thing I want to draw your attention to here is that people without hearing loss scored very accurately in the mid to high 80s or 90s right across the board. So they seem to perform as well face-to-face on our tasks as they did with under video conferencing. And just to give you a sense for this particular task, it says DCT. This is what we call our dynamic conversation test, where you're actually trying to follow a conversation between 2 people and remember things they're saying and recall them. So it's quite a realistic task of having to follow a conversation. So people without hearing loss don't seem to be affected by listening over video conferencing. But what about the people with hearing loss? Well, let me show you the same graph now. I'm showing you the same scale from top to bottom. So at the bottom is scoring very poorly, and at the top is scoring very well. Now I'm going to show you the performance of people with normal hearing, which is the filled symbols, and the people with hearing loss are the people with open symbols. Okay, and as you can see in face-to-face on our task, they're performing very similar because the people with hearing loss are using their hearing aids. They're aided properly. We tested their hearing aids, made sure they would set up okay, and they could do well face-to-face. Now, when we went to video conferencing, this is what we found. What you see is that both when the people with hearing loss were aided and when they were unaided, but even when they were aided, you see a significant difference between the people without hearing loss and the people with hearing loss, such that people with hearing loss are performing between 25 and 30% more poorly than people without hearing loss, but only when communicating via video conferencing. So this to us was very important evidence, because it was one of the first times that we had seen demonstrated that we could actually quantify the struggles that people with hearing loss can have, specifically when using a video conferencing platform. And this can arise for a number of different sort of technology reasons, but largely it's to do with what happens to the auditory signal when it gets sent over Zoom or Teams or any other video conferencing platform. Now, we measured a lot of different things, and I just want to summarize it on this graph. It looks complicated, but let me just bring you through it. The green area here is what we would consider the sort of normal range. That's the range of scores that we might see from people without hearing loss. And then what you see is that there are several instances where our hearing loss group are performing significantly poor. So I've already showed you some information where they're scoring poor on the actual speech comprehension task, but you can see they experienced significantly more listening effort, and they saw significantly poorer ratings of how well they thought they were understanding speech, their confidence level to actually do the tasks over video conferencing, and their satisfaction with how they felt they were performing. So this then led us to ask a really key question, which is, if people with hearing loss, now that we have solid evidence to show that they have significantly greater difficulties under very controlled conditions, now we can see what can help them actually perform better. And interestingly, one of the key things we saw is that just using your hearing aids and listening to, in this case, a laptop out of the loudspeakers, did not fully overcome the challenges that people have. So what else might help people? And so we looked at a variety of different options. So our research question then was, how do different methods of listening via video conferencing? So we're going to look at a range of things: Bluetooth streaming, something called Sonic Cloud software, and some other ways of listening, for example, over headphones. So we looked at headphones, which is a common use case. People with hearing aids might take their hearing aids off and put headphones on instead, or try to use their headphones with hearing aids. Using some sort of software on the laptop to help tweak the audio. In this case, we use the Sonic Cloud software, which I'll come and talk about, or Bluetooth streaming from the laptop directly to the hearing aids. And of course, just listening to the loudspeakers of the hearing aids. That's another condition we tested. Before I go on, I should say that although I do make reference to the Sonic Cloud software, this research was not funded by Sonic Cloud in any way, or the company behind that. It was funded by ourselves using our government funding. So for this, we had 25 hearing aid users across a wide range of ages, with various different sort of backgrounds and experiences with hearing aids, from as little as 1 year to almost 10 years of experience. Let me just break you down what we did. So we had our first setup, which was that we had a researcher on one laptop, and then over Zoom that connected to a participant who was listening to the loudspeakers of the laptop using their hearing aids. So that was similar to the research we had done before. But now we also tested it with and without this Sonic Cloud software, which allows people to tweak the sound quality to suit them. We also tested via headphones, where the participants took off their hearing aids and used headphones instead. And we also tested that with and without this Sonic Cloud software. And then finally, we also tested streaming directly to the participant hearing aids using the Zoom feature of a mobile phone that allowed the audio to be streamed directly to their devices. As I mentioned, we use this Sonic Cloud software. This was an example of what we call sound enhancing software, or just a software that you can install, for example, on a laptop, that allows you to customize the sound experience. In this case, with Sonic Cloud, people can vary the overall level of the sounds, like a volume control, but can also tweak various different parameters that allow them to get different levels of sort of acoustic experience. And whenever we used it, we brought people through a very standard way of tweaking the dials, so they felt like the audio was set up for them. And we did that separately for every condition, so they always felt like they were in the best condition for them. So let me just quickly bring you through what we measured. We measured lots of tests of understanding speech, both in quiet and noise. As I mentioned, we have this dynamic conversation test where people can follow a conversation, and then lots of self-report questionnaires. So we use something called the NASA Task Load Index. This is a great questionnaire that captures things like how hard were you having to work? Could you work quick enough to do the task? And also lots of self-report things like the acceptability of it and the sound quality and the satisfaction. And then finally, we asked people whether they were willing to use some of these more sort of technology-based solutions like Sonic Cloud or Bluetooth streaming in the future. So I'm just going to give you some high-level overview of the results. Here again, I'm just going to show you some information on groups with and without hearing loss. So this is actually comparing all of these different measures. Again, it looks complicated, but let me just pull you out the key results. What you see is a whole range of different findings from people comparing people with and without hearing loss, and as we expect for the people with hearing loss, that they're performing more poorly than people without hearing loss on almost all of our measures. So that replicates what we saw in the first study. But we were testing lots of different configurations of how to listen, and we said, hey, is this having an effect? If we compare people's best setup and their worst setup, does it make a difference how you listen to Zoom, for example? And this is what I'm showing here. And so what I'm showing here is the average participant score in their best condition, their worst condition, and then whether that was different. And what you see is essentially across the board, depending on how you set up your video call, you have a big difference in how people perform. So I'll just give you a few examples. On our dynamic conversation test, which again is following a two-talker conversation, the difference between the best and the worst was almost 30%. So people were performing significantly better when they had the right configuration for them versus listening in a configuration that wasn't working so well for them. We saw a significant reduction in listening effort, better speech understanding, improved sound quality, and it was more acceptable. So across the board, choosing the right condition made a big difference. So you might ask yourself, well, what were the conditions that people tended to perform best in? So let me show you. So here I'm showing you a graph with the various different conditions on the x-axis, so along the bottom here. So we've got free field, which is like listening through the loudspeakers. We've got headphones, both of those with and without Sonic Cloud, and then we've got Bluetooth streaming. I'm showing you where people perform their best for the test in quiet, which is the blue bars, and the test when there was a background noise in the orange bars. And you'll notice two things. First of all, for the blue bars, people tended to perform best in one of three conditions, either using the laptop speakers, using headphones with Sonic Cloud, or Bluetooth streaming. But when there was a background noise, people tended to perform best in two conditions, when they were using headphones, unable to tweak the audio, or directly streaming to their devices. So we're seeing some evidence here that specifically headphones with Sonic Cloud and Bluetooth streaming seem to be the conditions that allow most people to perform at their best. If we look at the self-reported experience, first of all, we see relatively high acceptability across the board. People are getting on with all the conditions. There's no condition that's particularly unacceptable, but there's a big difference in whether they are performing at their best in terms of effort, understanding, and sound quality. And let me just pull you out two key results here. First of all, if we look at the blue bars, higher here means that they were more likely to experience the lowest level of effort in those conditions. And you see again the same two conditions coming through, headphones with Sonic Cloud and Bluetooth streaming. That's where people were most likely to experience the lowest level of listening effort. And interestingly, when it came to sound quality and the overall experience, people seem to be most likely to have that experience in the headphones with Sonic Cloud condition. We also asked people some general preference questions, and we asked people what was their most preferred session. And you can see that overall, people preferred Bluetooth streaming as their most preferred, followed closely by headphones with Sonic Cloud. And then the other conditions were preferred by very few people indeed. And then finally, we were interested in Sonic Cloud and Bluetooth streaming because they were the sort of things that we thought people might not yet be using or have set up, particularly if their hearing aids had a Bluetooth feature, but they hadn't already set that up. And we asked people whether they thought after the experience of doing this, whether they might continue to use that feature. And what you can see is that the vast majority of people actually said that they were probably likely to use one or both of Sonic Cloud and Bluetooth streaming going forward, just based on their experience of trying it out in our research. So I'm just going to wrap up there. Hopefully that's been a useful overview of some of our recent research. I think the key message that we'd like to get across is that it really is an individual thing. There is no, you just set it up in this way and it will work best for everybody. There's a lot of variation, but what we can say is it really does make a difference how you listen through video conferencing calls, and it makes a difference what technology you use, and importantly, it makes a difference that it's the right technology for you. So one of the key messages that we have from this research is really to make sure you're trying out different solutions and trying to find the one that will work best for you, because it will make a difference depending on how you listen to video calls. With that, I'll hand back over to Theo, and thank you very much for your attention.
Now, Pork, am I audible? Just want to make sure my audio is coming
You are
through.
indeed.
Good. Well,
absolutely.
I'd like to say that this is a fascinating study, and I know even though it seems so simple, it's also very complex. I know the when you're thinking about the workforce and enterprises and Fortune 500 companies, there is a theme that if you have hearing loss, all you need is a good headset and a little bit more volume. And it's about time that there's actually some research showing that that's not true. I mean, it goes a little further than that. So my question to you is what are some takeaways for employers and recruiters? And I want you to think about best practices from various scenarios, like being fully remote or in a conference room with Zoom, and physically in a conference room and listening to that. And also think about answering this from a different work settings perspective. So when you're thinking about in office or blue and white collar workers. So what are some takeaways for larger organizations that they could utilize from this study?
Yeah, thanks, Theo. It's a very, very good question. And I think there are some really simple things that you have to get right in this situation, because I think that there's a current assumption that, well, as long as the audio is coming through, as long as the video's there, and as long as the captions are there, then surely that's all you need to do. And I think our research says, well, it turns out that when you're communicating, it turns out that the audio is quite important. I don't think anybody here would be shocked by that. But it's one of those things that we don't tend to think about very often in both contexts, actually. So let's go through some of the two key use cases you mentioned. So first of all, let's think of the sort of in-office typical work situation using any type of video conferencing. The first thing is to get the audio right. So some basics are, of course, making sure you've got a good connection. Because I should say that even the challenges that we demonstrated in our research about the difficulties people with hearing loss have, that was pretty much under the best conditions, right? A good internet connection, a stable internet connection. We know that's not always the case. So that's the first thing. Pay attention, for example, make sure that equipment is plugged in. Try to use wired instead of Wi-Fi if you can, things like that. Making sure that the internet is good enough to do this kind of communication. We wouldn't have a conversation with somebody when there's a huge amount of background noise in the room. We'd move somewhere else. So we also shouldn't be having online conversations when the internet weather isn't favorable and we can't have a good conversation. So that's the first thing. Second thing is get the audio right. So think about, is the quality of the speaker, for example, the loudspeaker in a room good enough? Is it something that's hanging on a wall 10 meters away? Or could there be something right in the middle of the table, for example? So these are really simple things that are easy to get wrong. And many rooms, unfortunately, still to this day, even if they're used for video conferencing, it's an afterthought, right? It's something that has been put in the room and then nobody's bothered to step back and go, hey, have we set this up really well and properly? So I think that's another key thing to get right. I would say to employers, particularly if you are communicating with people remotely, and particularly people who, for example, don't work for you yet, or don't work for you and don't have your specific equipment, or you haven't given them a particular laptop, is if you're asking people to communicate with you remotely, you also need to make sure that you've taken steps to make sure that the person on the other end knows what the different options are. For example, knows in advance to check if they're able to, for example, stream Bluetooth to their earbuds or their hearing aids, knows in advance, just like the excellent information that we got at the beginning of this webinar, where the settings are for the particular video conferencing system that you're using. For example, we're using Zoom today. In the settings, Zoom has various different modes, like different noise reduction modes, different sound quality modes, for example, that you can change. And I think if there was one key thing that came across from our research, is that no default or one bit of settings or one type of setting is going to work for everyone. And so I think that it's really important that if you're an employer, particularly talking to people outside your organization, and they're using your system to communicate, that you take the time to make sure that you've sent them information that helps them make sure they understand what features they might be able to adjust to make the audio experience the best. And then there's a really simple last one I'll go to, which is when you're communicating via video conferencing, take the time at the beginning of the call to make any adjustments and to ask the other person whether or not the audio is working for them, whether or not the quality is good enough for them. These are really simple steps. And the thing is, we rely on a lot of intuition when we communicate in person. We can sort of see if the person isn't quite understanding, and we might sort of stop and ask or adjust. That's much harder to do when you're at the end of a virtual screen. And actually, it's funny that we just don't stop and think, oh, maybe they're having challenges listening to me or hearing, or maybe I haven't actually checked whether they can hear me okay. So taking really simple steps just to be courteous and stop and say, okay, is the audio quality good enough? Is my microphone, so I'm speaking to you, is my microphone good enough? Am I in a very echoey room? Have I taken the time to make sure I'm being sort of accommodating by making sure that my microphone's good? Nothing worse than to join a call, for example, you're maybe attending an interview and you've got 5 people in an office room with a terrible microphone and you can't hear a word that they say. So really simple things that we can take. Make sure that you've set your room up right. Make sure that you're taking the time to make sure that the audio quality is good, and make sure that you take the time to check with everybody that they know what settings that they might be able to adjust, but also that everything is working well and that they can hear and communicate well. And if not, stop and readjust. And again, one final point is, if we were in person, we wouldn't just go, oh, you can't really hear what I'm saying. That's okay. We'll just continue on in this really noisy place. We would adjust. We would go somewhere else. We would maybe reconvene. So take the time, get it right. And then the sad thing about this is, if you don't do this, then typically only one part of the conversation struggles. But if we get it right, everybody has a better conversation and a better experience. So it's worth doing.
Now, I think that you bring up a great point. So just to reiterate what you said, getting the audio right, and taking the time to understand the needs for the audio experience for everyone is so important. It's so easy for all of us to, look over this. And I love the fact that you said that, everyone's hearing is going to be different. It's kind of like, if you look at people that have glasses, everyone sees a little bit differently. But if you have the right lens, then everyone's is going to bring everyone onto the same page. And it's the same thing with your ears. Everyone hears differently. Not one person has the same hearing ability as the other. And when you're living with hearing loss, that creates a huge gap. But just doing something simple as ensuring that the audio experience before you have a conversation is up to par for everyone, whether it be in a physical room or a virtual room. It's so important and so easy to overlook. And the fact that you pull together a study to finally elevate the importance of this is phenomenal, which I commend you for and your team. Now I'm also thinking about universities. So what are some things that universities can take away from this study, especially for their workplace and for their students, and for making that transition from a university to employment for people who live with disabilities and with hearing loss?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, a lot of the time these days, students will be immersed at university and at different colleges and schools in video conferencing, because more and more, even some universities now, despite the fact that we're years on from the pandemic, we had a big university here in Australia that decided that it was primarily going to now deliver lectures, for example, over video conferencing or online, for example, live streamed, as opposed to in person. So this shift seems to be staying with us. And this is where a lot of us have the sort of first experiences of using these systems, and then, of course, finish university and then go out into the big bad world. And so I think there's a few key things. One is making sure that they are at the forefront of best practice, making sure that people understand the technology, how it might benefit them. But also, if I may say, there's also an assumption that can be easily made, which is unless somebody has a hearing device or a diagnosis of a hearing loss and they've got to wear some sort of device, then we don't need to worry about, communication for that individual, right? So I think a lot of universities are still at the point where they think about it in terms of, we'll be ready to do something if the person registers as, for example, disabled or needs assistant or has a hearing problem. Whereas actually these days we know that large numbers of people identify with having hearing problems, even if they haven't gone and have a diagnosis from a hearing healthcare professional. That doesn't make their difficulties any less valid. And so we should be thinking, right, with technology, we can make it easier for everybody, no matter what device they use or no matter whether or not they've gone and seen and paid for a health professional. What we care about is that regardless of the status of the individual, everybody, if they have difficulties, able to get support. So that's the first thing universities can do, is making sure that they're making people aware of the technology, that they're helping people advocate to have the best kind of experience as well. So they're knowledgeable. So when they go out into the workforce, they're aware of what is good practice, what is a good way of doing this, how do I advocate for myself, and make sure that I know how to advocate, for example, to an employer about the kinds of technology available. I'm happy to talk about that because there's lots coming down the line in terms of technology that I think is going to make a lot of people's experience even better. And then finally, I think universities really need to think about how they balance online versus in-person learning as well, because just as I've said, our research says that no one particular way of listening will work best for everybody when it comes to video calls. Video calls and in person, the experience between the two will not be the same for everybody either. And so in reality, we need to think about, particularly in a learning environment, many different ways that people can and should be able to access a different learning experience. So for example, I know one particular university that provides, they have moved online for lectures, but they've provided different ways for students to listen to it. So you can still go into the university, you might not be in a big, huge, echoey lecture hall. They've actually got booths in different rooms that you can go to listen to lectures with really good sound setups, really good, really accessible. And that's a way of sort of blending the two technologies. You're listening online, but you think about how can we make it easy for people to access a good experience.
And that I love the fact that you brought up the user experience. And if I were to think back when I was in college, if I had the option to either be on a conference call and with captions and audio enhancement software and a headset and be able to push out the surrounding sounds that would interfere with my ability to hear and participate, I would have opted for that. So when you think about the user experience, you're including more people, and that's important for universities to understand. You want to have more students come in of all diverse backgrounds, both able-bodied and people who live with disabilities. So that's very important to enhance, of course, your student base. So when I'm thinking now, I'm also thinking about when I started applying for jobs, and my biggest fear really was to be on a call with a recruiter and doing that very first interview to for a role that I really wanted, And this is, when I graduated, that the technology wasn't quite available then, and it wasn't quite where it is. It wasn't quite at where it is now. So I wanted to ask, from an HR perspective, how can you bring this study? How can those out there, in the HR realms, bring this study to their to their teams and show the value to it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important, and this is such an important touch point for anybody if we think about it when we're maybe going for a job interview, talking to a new company or a new place of work. I mean, these are big moments in our lives, right? These are really serious points in our lives, make a big difference. I think a really key thing that I've seen done really well is particularly HR, human resources, taking responsibility in advance of when the call is supposed to take place to have a bit of a communication setup session, testing session. So, for example, make sure that you go into the room at the company, as an example, where the interview will take place. Call the person from that room, make sure that their audio is working, ask them in advance to make sure they go use exactly the same computer, the same setup, the same room. And then you've got time to make adjustments in advance. So you're showing from your point of view that you really want to hear from the candidate. You want to get the best from them, give them their best opportunity, because ultimately you're trying to find the best person, for example, for a role. And so it just makes sense from everybody's point of view to make sure that you can also have the best conversation with that person so you can learn the most about them. So that's good for everybody, right? That's good for the employer and it's good for the potential employee. Make sure you take the time. Don't just give them a call from your desk and then forget that the conversation will happen in a conference room down the hall. Like I said, a lot of times that room may have been set up for very particular kinds of calls, and you'll end up with 5 people in a room with a very poor microphone or a poor speaker or whatever it is. So go to the actual room, make the call from there as if it will be on the day, and then you've got time to check the person can hear properly. If the microphone is poor and they can't hear the room very well, if there's something wrong with their setup, then work with them to figure out what can be done, but also be knowledgeable. So I don't think that it's okay to just sort of completely assume that if there's any challenges with listening on the person you're trying to communicate with, that somehow it's all on them and they've got to go away and figure it out. Be knowledgeable. What platform are you using? If it's Zoom, for example, do you know what settings it has and what you might advise them to adjust? Can you advise them about what different options? So if they're struggling to hear, for example, because of the quality of the laptop and the loudspeaker, what would you say to them, right? And if they use hearing aids, what might you recommend? I mean, our research would say recommend that they maybe try connecting to the call using a tablet or something, or a laptop that can Bluetooth directly to their hearing aids, or try some sort of sound enhancing software. I gave you the example of SonicCloud with headphones, and see if customizing the audio experience makes it easier to hear, because every call will be different, every microphone will be different. So those are really key things. I would also say, from the point of view of the person going into that situation, for many people, it will be a very positive thing if you reached out in advance and said, hey, I've got an interview coming up. I want to make sure that I can do my best in that interview. Please, can you make sure that you give me, that we arrange a pre-session, please, to make sure I can hear the room and I can make sure that I can, hear you well enough. And I would be pushing people to advocate for that as well, because if lots of people do that, it also tells employers that this is something that they should be doing. And I think it also shows that the person cares about the interview, they care about the experience, they really want to make sure they can communicate well. So it shouldn't have to be that way. Really, the employer should be thinking, how do we make this an accessible experience? Because ultimately that will help them find the best person for whatever role they're looking for. So I think those are some simple things. Make sure you're prepared in advance. Make sure you take the time to call people, make sure the technology works, make any adaptations that are required just to make it a good experience. Because guess what? When I've seen that work really well, it's the people in the employer, the interviewers also love it, because they have much better conversations. It's a better experience for everybody, and nobody loses from this. So it's all positive.
I'm looking for my mute button. Now, those are all fantastic points. And if I were to take something away from that, I would hear from what you're saying, Padraig, is our HR professionals, our recruiters, our Fortune 500 companies, they need to be thinking about standards when it comes to the technology that you're using to connect with your potential talent. Because if you're just to your point, if you're reaching out to someone who could change the whole course of your organization and help you rise up, and you can't have a simple conversation with them just to understand what talent lies beneath the surface, then there's an issue. And it's such a simple fix, like you're saying, just understanding the standards you need to be at from an audio perspective to ensure that you're providing an accessible experience, especially for those with hearing loss. But it also, it also blends into the world of people without hearing loss too. So it's a win-win for all, and it opens up that talent pool that may go unnoticed as well. So when I'm thinking about what you said, ensuring ahead of time that your interview is prepared to provide you, a person with hearing loss, with the best possible experience for that conversation with your recruiter, or even if you're already in the workforce going over to another position. I get that thought in my head where, people may be out there who are afraid to self-identify as a person with hearing loss. So how do you see this study empowering those individuals to come forward and be empowered to ask for what they need to have a robust conversation, especially when it comes to interviews, or even if you're in the workforce asking for accommodations, to be able to make yourself capable to bring your whole self to work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I hope that our research is useful in, first of all, people being able to point to it and say, look, researchers have shown that people with hearing loss have difficulty, specifically when using video conferencing, that people without hearing loss don't seem to have. And so this is real, it exists, and it's complicated because it's not just about the number of words you can hear, it's about the amount of effort that you're having to expend, it's about all these different elements of having a good communication experience. And, had we done it for a very long period of time, we would have also expected, because of the high levels of effort, to see people being incredibly fatigued. So again, we've talked about research where we're doing it in relatively time limited, but for most of us, video calls are an all-day experience, whether we like it or not. And I know some people, colleagues of mine, they're just so exhausted at the end of the day, because this is a tiring thing if you're having to expend just that little bit of extra effort through every single meeting. So, this is really, really, really important. So I hope that the research is useful in not just demonstrating that, look, this problem really exists, it's really there, and it's a big, big, big effect, big challenge, but also that there are different solutions that work for different people. And that's just a key point I want to keep emphasizing. It's not like you can just do one thing and you're like, well, we've done that now and that should be fine and that should be good enough. No, a key thing is that you've got to find the right technology solution that works well with the hearing of the individual. As you say, different people have different experiences. And so this is really important also from an employer's point of view. Now, things will get better. I think standards are improving, and particularly I want to point, before we run out of time, to Auracast, which I think is going to be and newer Bluetooth technologies, which I think is going to be a game changer, because as not just hearing aids, but OTC hearing aids and also ear buds from all the major manufacturers, as they start to integrate Auracast, we now finally getting hearing aid streaming as standard from Windows laptops and Mac laptops and phones. That will be a big game changer, because even at the moment, getting Bluetooth streaming to work consistently from a work computer is very hard. So I think employers also need to be thinking into the future and saying, are we investing in the right technology so that anybody who's working with us and for us already has a very sort of access to the latest standards? And so, for example, anybody should be able to stream Bluetooth from a laptop with Auracast, for example, because all hearing aids in the future will support that. So these are really simple things. But I'm hoping the research will help emphasize that there is a big problem here, big challenge, but there are really, really good solutions and it's about trying out and customizing the experience for the individual. So I hope that sort of evidence is useful to help people self-advocate for their needs.
Well said. So now I'm going to, Padraig, I really appreciate this, all this wonderful information, of course, your research that has been done, and I'll pass it over to Michael to start our Q&A.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you both. Very, very good presentation. So the first question is kind of an easy one. Theo, this one is for you. What headphones are you using? They look very comfortable, and this person's looking for some to fit over their hearing aids.
This is a question my way, you said? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, these are actually, and I don't endorse anything on this call, of course, but these are just Jabra headsets with connected via Bluetooth.
Excellent. Thank you, Theo. And this question is for you, Pádraig. It looks like this person said is asking, is there a comparable chart to the first chart that you showed, showing the loss of comprehension on video conference calls for people with hearing loss, and then the improvement when using Bluetooth stream hearing aids and or sound enhancement software? I can't remember. I feel like you might have had a slide that shows something similar. Do you mind showing that again?
Yeah, and maybe I'll, what I can do is, I don't think I have quite that particular slide in the deck, but what I can do is make sure I add it before we put the slides up on the website for people. And the simple matter is when I think I reported in a table, but we saw when, between people's best and worst configurations, we saw about a 30% improvement in their ability to follow a conversation. So, a big difference. And so, people were performing near enough to 80–90% following the conversation in their best condition, which tended to be Bluetooth streaming or headphones with this SonicCloud software, versus in the worst condition, which interestingly, and maybe I didn't point out very specifically, but almost inevitably the worst condition for almost everybody was using headphones without any kind of sound enhancing software and without their hearing aids. So people really struggled in a really common condition that we all tend to think is the best way to listen. And so that's also a really important message, which is you might think that that's helping you, but actually direct Bluetooth streaming or maybe using some software like SonicCloud to tweak your audio quality might have a significant improvement if you're going to use headphones.
Excellent. Thank you. And this other question, and I answered this directly in the Q&A box, but I want to make sure I gave the right answer. So for Zoom and Teams and other platforms similar to that, when they have the captions on it, are they employing what is called ASR, or automatic speech recognition? Is that what's powering the live captioning?
Yeah, so well, it depends. So for example, a fantastic call like this, we've got a real expert doing live captioning, and you cannot do better than that. As much as we like technology, having an expert do live captioning is still gold standard, and I would still advocate for that in as many situations as possible. Where the technology generates the captions themselves, yes, it's using automatic speech recognition. The good thing is that has tended to improve a lot. I still remember when Microsoft Teams and Zoom first got captioning, and it was absolutely terrible. And it has, in fairness, got better, but it is still very hit or miss. And one of the things that I really don't like is that there's still limited settings for how you can adjust, for example, the size of the captions. So often they're still too small, or they're in, so they're getting better. And what I would say is it's good to dive in and make sure you know what you can change about it. So for example, I have colleagues where, they really appreciate being able to make the font a different color, for example, or make it a different size, because it makes a big difference when you're in an hour-long call and you're trying to listen to all of the words that are being said. There are some additional software. I can't make any specific recommendations, but there are software where you can actually have a separate system do the live captioning, not having to rely on Zoom or Teams. You can listen to the audio coming through your computer and do live captioning. So look at different options. But I think the good news is the technology is just getting better and better. So hopefully the quality of automatic captions should continue to improve.
Excellent, thank you. And I think in the spirit of time, I'm just gonna pass on one last question. So for those that are wanting to lead this webinar and want to share with their employer, for example, ways they can ask for, various accommodations consistent with the Americans with Disability Act, or just general accommodations, where might they find these resources, and how would they go about providing that to their employer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think if I may, I would say that as soon as we get this webinar and get our slides up on the HLAA website, I would recommend that you point them directly there, where obviously they can also reach out to the experts on your working group to make sure they get the right type of ongoing advice for their situation. I think a really critical thing is to start conversations, particularly with the IT part of any employer, because I think making sure they're aware and thinking ahead for as they upgrade their technology, making sure that every single, for example, laptop that they're buying is going to be Bluetooth compliant with hearing aids, that they're making sure that they're prioritizing getting those upgrades and features as they're added to Windows and Mac, enabled and distributed to the organization. Make sure that they've taken the time to make sure that their employees can actually use all the features of Teams or Zoom. Sometimes those features are locked off and you can't change them. So those are simple things, sitting down with somebody, for example, in IT and saying, hey, go through my setup with me and make sure that I can actually use all the technology. Other thing that is missed a lot is, have they actually asked anybody about whether, for example, most employers will provide a headset often, right? Has anybody actually asked whether that headset's of any good quality, for example? Because I've seen employers who are employers of people with hearing loss at scale provide very poor quality headsets to people. And so the other thing is actually giving them feedback, talking to them and saying, hey, do you realize that the tools that you're giving us make it too hard? And it's not like you need a Rolls Royce of headsets. You just need to sit down and make sure you've got a good solution that's likely to be useful. So I think I would be pointing them to the HLAA website, but I would also be engaging with them, particularly on the technology side, to make sure that the right type of technology and the permissions to adjust the settings are all in place to get the best experience. And then finally, there's nothing better than having people within an organization remind everybody as part of the culture that having good etiquette with meetings and taking the time to make sure people can communicate, that's a positive thing for everybody. And so we try to do that here at NAL, and we encourage others to do it as well. So thinking about who's very influential in your company, who can just take that time to say, hey, before we begin, can I make sure that everyone can hear me? Can I make sure that if we need to adjust any of the sound? Those are simple things to do, but can make a big difference in terms of the culture that you're generating within the organization to put communication first.
Excellent, thank you. And in the spirit of time, I'm going to now wrap this up and pass it on to Robin to officially cross the finish line. Thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation and great advice.
Thanks, Michael. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thanks, Pádraig and Theo, for presenting today. And of course, thanks, Lisa, for your amazing cart services, as usual. Just another reminder, this webinar will be on the HLAA website at hearingloss.org. Look on there for any future webinars or any webinar recordings, including this one. Thanks to everyone who joined us today, and have a great night. Bye.
Thanks all.